Good morning, folks, and thank you all so much for coming out to the sixth and final live Q&A in our Meals That Change the World series with Dr. Laura Carlson. For the next 20 minutes, we're going to be diving into the great questions you submitted to us in response to Laura's sixth and final lecture, looking at JFK's famous state banquet in 1962. We've got a lot of great questions to run through this morning. But before we jump into those questions, I just want to remind all of you at home that we've just launched our first ever summer season of Curious Minds courses. We've just put 2 new courses open for registration on our website, and they will begin streaming on our online platform at the end of July. These include an exciting new series on Neil Young by Dr. Mike Daly, one of our current Curious Minds lecturers and a Curious Minds favorite, and an exciting series we're calling The Age of Reinvention, looking at the cultural movements of the post-World War II decades, led by another popular Curious Minds favorite, Dr. Peter Harris. So if you've been enjoying our offerings at Curious Minds this spring, make sure to check out our website for more information on these 2 exciting new courses. In the meantime, it is a real pleasure to check in for one final grand finale with our favorite food historian, Dr. Laura Carlson. Please join me in giving her your warmest Curious Minds welcome.
Hi, it's good to be here. Hello.
It's great to connect with you, Laura. So we've got some great material to go through today. We're going to kick things off by just quickly running through some good questions folks send us in response to last week's lecture on the Titanic. And then we'll dive into a few meaty questions looking at JFK's banquet that was at the center of our 6th and final lecture. So let me kick things off just sort of quickly here with a few fun Titanic questions that we got. We got quite a few on sort of similar themes. The first one I'd love to hear your thoughts on was an interesting one, asking if kosher food was available on the Titanic.
This is a great question, and I wish I had time to go into it in the lecture, because there's an entire, I want to say, development that we're witnessing around the time of the Titanic with the new availability of kosher cuisine, kosher food, and even kosher, say, dinnerware, plates and whatnot, available on grand cruise ships, luxury liners like the Titanic. So we know that Charles Kennel, we actually know the name, who was the specific cook in charge of preparing kosher meals on the Titanic. This actually wasn't his first assignment. He had worked on the Titanic sister ship, the Olympic. And we know actually a surprising amount about him. He was born in South Africa, trained as a chef, and then started working for the White Star Line and whatnot. But indeed, he had not only obviously all the skills and know-how of preparing kosher meals for the White Star Line, first on the Olympic and the Titanic, but he also, of course, in accordance with kind of kosher law, kosher regulations, had his own kitchen essentially as part of the Titanic. And this really had started to become a feature we would see kind of starting right around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, with the large amounts of immigration or movement of peoples from Eastern Europe to Western Europe and over to the Americas, many Jewish communities moving and taking, obviously, steamships from Western Europe over to the Americas. There was a need to provide kosher cuisine to these communities. And so more and more we see the availability of kosher meals on liners like the Titanic. So not only was there a kosher kitchen, there was obviously someone preparing the meals, the kosher meals, but as I mentioned, part and parcel to that, there was also kosher dinnerware that was all stamped in Hebrew and in English that designated it either appropriate for meat or for milk or dairy products. And some of that actually has survived from both the Titanic and I believe from the Olympics. So if you go online and search, you can actually see some of the examples of this kosher dinnerware from this period of, again, the Titanic, the Olympic, and whatnot. Unfortunately, we do know that Charles Kennel, the kosher chef on the Titanic, did not survive the sinking. He was one of the many people who were working in the kitchens who did not survive Titanic's loss, unfortunately.
Mhm. A lot of audience members wrote in also to ask you about sort of a more practical logistical question just about refrigeration on the Titanic. How did they preserve these vast quantities of food, especially things like ice for oysters and cocktails? What insights can you shed there?
Well, I can say first off, yes, refrigeration was absolutely available on the Titanic. And as I said, the sister ships, all of them were outfitted very similarly. And again, if we think about 1912, turn of the 20th century, refrigeration was still fairly new as a technology. Most people in their homes obviously wouldn't have had a fridge or a refrigerator as we think about it today, but maybe an ice box. But indeed, there were electric refrigerators, or at least refrigeration as they called them, plants, entire gigantic kind of contraptions that were responsible for keeping, because remember, on this crossing from England to New York, we're talking about a week. And so if we think about all of the eggs, the dairy, the milk, the meat that would have been served in all of the dining rooms, all of the various meals, you absolutely needed to think about how to keep these things cold. So yes, it was one of the kind of crowning pride, shall we say, kind of the boasts that Olympic and Titanic could claim, that they were outfitted with the most modern of technologies for their kitchens, that they could keep all of these things cold. So they had actual refrigeration, kind of walk-in fridges we would think of, but also machines to make ice for, say, cocktails, to keep the oysters chilled, even for chilling drinking water, so that they could offer cold drinking water to the passengers, mostly in the first and second classes. But absolutely would have been available, but would have been something that would have been something to really boast about as far as its availability, and would not have been available even, say, 5 years previous if you had been on a steamship.
Mm-hmm. So very much at the cutting edge of the intersection of technology and the culinary arts.
Absolutely.
Okay, then last question on the Titanic. There's a lot of interest in sort of the separation of classes within the ship. Were all the ship's classes, both the first class, steerage, etc., were all their meals cooked in the same kitchen, or were they cooked in different kitchens?
Short answer, different kitchens. But just as we talked about for, say, the kosher chef, he had his own kitchen. If we actually put all the kitchens, or say preparation areas, and we all kind of number them, there were probably more about 5 different kitchens on the Titanic. Now, in terms of separating by class, there was mostly one large kitchen for, say, the first and second class dining areas, the actual dining rooms. And then there was an entirely separate kitchen for third class passengers, for steerage. But above and beyond that, there was an entirely different kitchen, or say preparation area, for the a la carte restaurant. And then you have to add on top of that the kosher kitchen. So you actually do have a number of different areas of the ship that was involved with food preparation, cooking, and whatnot. But yes, let's say if we're just talking about dividing by class, first and second had really a designated large kitchen, and third class would have had its own separate kitchen responsible for the majority of the meals that were served in the dining rooms.
Okay, let's move on then to the JFK dinner, because that's the subject of our grand finale here, and we got a lot of interesting questions here. The first was a good question from Kelly Pollock, who wrote in to say that she was astounded to see the way in which the spouses of the Nobel Prize winners at the dinner were often referred to as Mrs. insert husband's name, last name. Even in the case of the famous writer Pearl Buck, who was referred to by her husband's last name rather than by her own name. Kelly writes in to say, I knew of this custom from my mother, who even as late as 1978 was referred to in correspondence by her husband's name. However, I'm curious as to when this changed. How did this almost offensive and seemingly antique custom start, and when did it end? Was it always done in formal occasions and carried out all over the world, or just in North America?
This is a fantastic question, and I'm glad someone brought it up, because yes, if you look at that long list of invitees and guests to this dinner, you do see, even though the guests of honor were Mrs. George C. Marshall and Mrs. Hemingway, even though at this point, their husbands have passed away, they're still referred to by their husband's name, even though they're going by themselves. I mean, in terms of when this custom started, I mean, we could go all the way back in time, not necessarily all the way to the Roman period, but certainly by the time that we're looking at the medieval world in Western Europe, certainly, and in many areas, not necessarily so formally as we see the wife taking the husband's name upon marriage, but the idea that the wife is joining the husband's family, we do see that, for centuries back and all over the world where the custom of marriage has existed. And unfortunately, it does date to this very business-like transaction understanding of marriage, that the woman's kind of property is going to the husband's family, and so the husband becomes, say, the head of this new family that's created through the marriage. Now, in terms of the actual convention of Mr. and Mrs. so-and-so, so let's take the example of Mr. and Mrs. George C. Marshall. Right. Now, that is interesting in terms of, again, when do women just become their husband's name and are only referred to by their husband's name? I mean, again, all the way back in time. What's interesting that in North America, this is a custom we can see 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, into the 20th century. The first time that we actually see a woman not taking a man's name and actually kind of being very abrupt about it is a wonderful woman by the name of Lucy Stone. And she's the first known American woman to have kept her name, her birth name, her maiden name, after marriage. She married Henry Blackwell in 1855. I was able to do a whole bunch of searching on this. And it's actually a really interesting history that I wish we could have more time to go into. It takes us off to another route from food history. But essentially, she was the first person to say, this is an equal and permanent partnership. Those were her words when she got married. And that I have a right to retain my name because I'm an equal partner in this marriage. I'm not just simply becoming part of my husband's family. Now, she, had a full and long life. She was an abolitionist. She was a suffragette. But essentially, even after she died, her name, Lucy Stone, became this kind of associated word for women who want to retain their names after marriage. And so oftentimes women, particularly around, say, the 1920s, we're now into the 20th century and beyond, they were called Lucy Stoners if they wanted to retain their name after marriage. Now, unfortunately, from a legal perspective and an etiquette perspective, in terms of why these women were still called by their husband's name, say on this dinner from 1962, unfortunately, women were considered, by and large, kind of part of their husband's family. And when they did marry, they were not necessarily forced, but let's just say life could be very difficult for women who did not take their husband's name. We see up until the 1970s, it was actually very difficult, or you could even face fines for trying to register to vote under your maiden name and not your husband's name if you were a married woman, trying to get a bank account in the United States, trying to claim Social Security. All of these things were actually entirely written around the idea that women necessarily took their husband's name and actually found it quite difficult to try and retain their own name even after they were married, or even after their husband had passed away, even trying to go back to their maiden name after they became widows. So I went to, of course, the ultimate source in etiquette for this, which is, of course, Emily Post from the 1920s again. And she says very, very clearly, and I mean, this is echoed in all of these subsequent editions of her etiquette books, that women necessarily had to be called by their husband's name, and not even say, Mrs. Emily Smith. It had to be Mrs. Joe Smith. And that was the correct and proper way to address a woman, even after, say, her husband had passed away. So in the case of, say, George C. Marshall, even though she had her own name, she had her own maiden name, necessarily she remained Mrs. George C. Marshall. So it's unfortunately, both from a legal perspective and at least in terms of etiquette, even into the 1960s, this was the accepted way that, and almost legally required way that many women were referred to. We only see this changing really in the 1970s, that we see a revival of women saying, I do not want to take my husband's name. I shouldn't have to take my husband's name to do all of these things like register to vote, have a bank account, get a driver's license. So that's when we start to see a lot of that legislation change to say, if you want to keep your own name, you won't be penalized for it. But this is a much longer and bigger story, but it is an excellent question as far as why these women who were, legends in their own right appear as Mrs. Husband's name on this very formal dinner. But that, unfortunately, even in 1962, even with the Kennedys, that we're still not to the 1970s. So that was etiquette at the White House, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. So shifting gears, Laura, to the food itself. Diane writes in to ask if you could comment on how presidential eating has evolved in the decades since Kennedy's banquet. I know much has been made of Bill Clinton and Donald Trump's unhealthy eating habits and the Obama's efforts to introduce healthy foods grown in the White House garden.
This is a great question because, of course, we have Rene Verdun being the famous chef that created this meal in 1962. And as I mentioned in the lecture, he really only makes it into the Johnson administration, that they have this famous falling out. Very similarly in that the Johnsons were not fans of the haute cuisine that Rene Verdun was a big proponent of. So they parted ways. They hired a new executive chef called Henry Haller, and he's probably, well, up until right now, actually, he was one of the longest serving White House chefs. He was in the White House from 1966 to 1987. But even though, the Johnsons, who had gotten rid of Verdun, or Verdun quit in protest, even though this kind of French thing was not all about the Johnson administration, Haller was still a very much French influenced chef. Now, he started bringing in some American produce, bringing in some American wines, for example, as those started to become more and more recognized on an even playing field as, say, French wines. But it did stay very much, when they were having state dinners at a formal level, very much French influenced. Now, when we talk about healthy eating, it's really when we get into the Clinton era, that's when we start seeing a new focus at the White House for low fat, which of course was the big health trend in terms of nutrition in the 1990s. And so that's right around when we see, it's after Henry Haller, there's actually a new chef that was in the White House at this time that was there. His name was Pierre Chambrin. You might be able to tell he's also French. And he was there when the Clintons entered the White House, but he refused because, again, French chef, loved his cream, loved his butter, loved, his oils. And the Clintons wanted low-fat cooking. So we had another kind of not exactly meeting of the culinary minds. So Pierre Chambrin kind of bowed out of the White House. But interestingly, the replacement, Walter Schreib, was the new executive chef. And he was much more, on par in terms of he was willing to cook the low-fat diets that Hillary and Bill wanted. But at the exact same time as that, not only are we seeing a new introduction of nutrition or healthy eating in the White House, we're also seeing increased emphasis and encouragement to showcase American food in the White House, that now may be pulling away from that French influence of that can only be the upper class. This is what we can serve for state dinners and whatnot. American food can be just as fine dining as French cuisine can be. So Walter Schreib is really kind of one of the first chefs that shows off, Tex-Mex, Californian cuisine, all these different kinds of American influences from the different regions of the States. He really emphasizes that in his cooking. Now, he was there until 2005, I believe, and that's when we see the kind of beginnings of the current White House chef, who is Christetta Comerford. And she's the first official woman to have the title of executive White House chef. But it's almost a misnomer. I mean, I don't want to take anything away from her because she's been there now since 2005, 15 years, and she'd even worked in White House kitchens before that. So obviously a long tenure in the White House regardless. But it's almost, I always want to say, a false understanding to say this was the first woman who was in charge of the White House kitchens, just because really she's just the first person or the first woman to have the title of executive chef that was created by Jackie Kennedy in the 1960s. There have been many women who really headed up the White House kitchens prior to that. It's just the title had not existed prior to that. But Christetta Comerford was, again, when she came in 2005, we're starting to just get into the Obama administration. And of course, the rise of, again, a lot of that emphasis on the White House kitchen gardens. There had been White House kitchen gardens before that, but they weren't on the South Lawn, which is the new kind of famous one that Michelle Obama was really kind of in charge of and kind of made very well known. There actually were other White House gardens that they used in the kitchens on the roof, actually, that they were using just in a smaller sense, but they did exist from the 1990s into the 2000s, and then they were expanded onto the South Lawn. So, it's interesting because we have these chefs that actually last for years, decades even, right? With Christetta Comerford and then Hall and Sheeb. They went through numerous administrations of all kinds of palates, all kinds of tastes, all kinds of predilections. So it's an interesting, probably quite delicate balancing act to be a White House chef, that you may be changing your type of cuisine served every 4 years. I'm sure Christetta Comerford has seen a bit of a change from the Obama years to the Trump years. But it's interesting that they are also required to be quite diplomatic, that we don't see a lot of, public announcements from Christetta Comerford about the different kinds of cuisine that she has had to do between, say, the Obamas and the Trumps.
Yeah, I'll just add on that last point. I was a journalist in DC through much of the Obama administration, and I think you could really see the kind of the elevation, the apotheosis of American foodie culture through the Obama's years in the White House, a sort of an acceleration of what you're talking about, Laura, of eating regional American cuisines and celebrating them to celebrate American diversity, but then also just this savoring and appreciation of the art of cuisine in a way that I think maybe previous presidents may not have had, quite such sophisticated palates. It was just a feature of life in DC at that time, was to have your path home or your walk to your apartment shut down because inevitably the Obamas were dining out on a Tuesday night at some trendy new American bistro down the street from you, and that was something I had to deal with all the time. So anyways, yes, the Obamas are a fascinating case study in particular of showing how far, through their experience, how far America's palate as a country had evolved by the time they took office. But now we're running out of time here, but we've got one last great question that I think is a nice sort of way to cap this great series, bring us up into the present date, and bring us back home here to Canada. And it's a question from Roseanne, who asks, Laura, you've been chosen to host a virtual Canada Day dinner for our Curious Minds audience. What will you serve?
Oh, this is a great question. And for when I first thought about it, I thought, oh, well, let's just take one dish from all of these 6 meals that we've looked at. But I thought that wouldn't be fair to Canada, because Canada itself has such a great culinary and food history. And so for Canada Day, of course, we would want to be showcasing some of this great food and culinary history in this country. So, I was thinking, it was a bit of a balance because I wanted to show all the different provinces, all the different, coast to coast to coast, showcase the produce, showcase the food and culinary traditions. But it's difficult because it's also Canada Day, which means it's July, which means it's quite hot. So I have to think of, well, what would I want to be eating in early July? So unfortunately, I started with Newfoundland lobster bisque, which may not be the best thing to have on a hot summer day, but I thought, what other better way to celebrate kind of East Coast maritime traditions. I then tried to kind of move myself westward, and I thought on the grill, of course, we could have barbecued the lobster and whatnot, but I thought what would be really great on the barbecue was a Tamworth heritage pig, like a pork loin or something like that, which is this great heritage breed of pigs that we find through kind of Quebec and Ontario. And they're known as this red pig. They're this most delicious kind of porky, but kind of a little bit wild heritage breed that really has only been able to survive thanks to its existence in Canada. It came over from the British Isles, but it's Canadian farmers or pig farmers that have really kind of brought this heritage breed back. So I thought that would be a good showcase of the middle kind of Quebec and Ontario. We could not go without a summer iconic corn on the cob. Like what would be better for a summer kind of outside holiday feast, shall we say. I also thought wild rice as a side dish, again, showcasing something that was a staple crop for so many communities right around the Great Lakes region. 100% would go perfectly with this meal that we're concocting. And then I thought, well, wild berries, blueberries, particularly from kind of British Columbia, perfect season for them. This is at their height, kind of July, even kind of like late June into August. They'd be perfect at their peak. If we had like a blueberry bush, we could just go out and kind of wander and forage for them. Maybe throwing on some maple syrup and fresh cream, but I thought, if you want to stick to it, just wild blueberries. And I thought that would be a nice, simple, but coast to coast way of celebrating a virtual Canada Day dinner.
As always, Laura, you leave us very, very hungry. It's a good thing we scheduled these in the last slot of the morning to take us into the lunch hour. This has been a delight, Laura. We've taken an extraordinary journey through time, through the centuries, over the course of this series, from ancient Egypt up to Canada Day 2020. Thank you so much for sharing your great historical insights and stories with us. A huge thank you to all of you at home who've checked in with us and sent us so many great questions, and really, come out and supported us in this inaugural digital season of Curious Minds. I mean, Laura and I, when we first started talking, thought we were going to do something at the cinema, and here we are in this new medium, and you guys at home have really rolled with it. We're so grateful for your enthusiasm and your support. As I mentioned, we've got 2 exciting new Curious Minds courses open for registration now. They begin at the end of July. Don't hesitate to let me know if you've got any questions. And we're going to have more from Laura Carlson as well coming down the pipe back at Curious Minds in the not too distant future. So stay tuned for more from her. Thank you again, Laura. Thank you to all of you at home. Have a wonderful summer, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Bon appetit.
Bon appetit.